Hello. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to one of the greatest works of English literature. This really is one of the works that all of English literature looks back to as a pivotal moment in the development of the English language and really of any work written in English, because it is one of the first major literary attempts that was actually written in the language of the common people, in the English language. And of course that would place it in the Middle Ages. So this video is going to introduce you to the author, it's going to introduce you to the time period, and give you some background on the work itself before you begin reading it. We need to talk a little bit about the Middle Ages in general. And you've covered the Middle Ages in history. You know it is a time of beautiful castles, of horrible plagues, and of a lot of other elements that we don't particularly want to go back to. But there were some good things about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages had people who possessed typically a very religious worldview. Even if their religious views were often wrong, they saw the world in a way that at times was probably more accurate than the way most modern people see the world. The Middle Ages at times it's often called medieval times or the Dark Ages. I think the Dark Ages is a phrase that is pejorative. It's used to criticize the Middle Ages, to suggest that it was a time of darkness, a time of ignorance, and I don't think that that's accurate. I think there were ignorant people, there were some ignorant ideas that were dominant at the time, but the Dark Ages is probably not a fair description of the time period. The Middle Ages began after the fall of the Roman Empire, which is 476 is a good date for that, when the Roman Empire collapsed. William the Conqueror, 1066, really sets up a lot of things for what will happen in the Canterbury Tales, partly because the Norman conquest will have a huge impact on the English language. We've referenced this before. The English language begins as what's more commonly known as Anglo-Saxon English, or Old English, and then you had a heavy influence of French from the Norman conquest. With the coming of the French, the Norman conquest, and then earlier on you had the influence of Latin through the church. English begins to take a shape. The language of English begins to take shape that makes it look more like what we have today, which is this odd amalgamation of Anglo-Saxon or what is truly Old English, like what we saw in Beowulf, and then the large vocabulary borrowed from Latin and French or other Romance languages. But a lot of that influence of French came with the Norman conquest in 1066. The quality of life during the Middle Ages is not admirable, to say the least. Most people were dirt poor, in the most obvious meaning of that word. even those who were wealthy lived lives that, by our standards, would be extremely hard. I think the picture in the slide is, of course, taken from Monty Python's The Quest for the Holy Grail. A few pictures from that. I think that movie itself is truly unfortunate because it advocates a view of the Middle Ages that is really dark. It presents the people in the worst light possible in most cases, and it also lends itself towards some of the worst aspects of modern thinking. Two of those aspects of modern thinking that are truly unfortunate are the viewpoint that nothing is sacred. And so in this movie, people laugh at death. They laugh at things that are truly tragic. And so it's this postmodern mentality that there really is nothing that is above or below our sense of humor. The other aspect of modern thinking that this movie really fosters is chronological snobbery, where we look back at everyone in the past and think about how much better we are than them. And so this absence of the sacred and this idolization of our own thinking are two truly unfortunate aspects of the movie Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail. Nevertheless, it is a movie that has influenced how many people think about the Middle Ages. And so I wanted to address it directly and admit that some of the things that it presents, the highly superstitious nature of people in the Middle Ages, that's accurate. But the other aspects are really just sensational and show our own arrogance in many ways. The Middle Ages was a time in which society was highly structured. This goes back to the concept of the great chain of being, the idea that from God down to inanimate objects, so from the highest imaginable being to the lowest being we can see, everything has its place in that chain, and everything is under the authority of the things above it, of everything above it. And it is an abrogation or an attack on nature, and ultimately an attack on God for things that are lower in rank to rebel against things that are higher in rank. The king was seen as closer to God and thus endowed with the authority of God himself. And so two of the major ideas that highly influenced medieval thought were the concept of the great chain of being and the concept of the divine right of kings. And you will see those two ideas in almost every literary work from the time period. You'll see how those ideas influenced their thinking. Of course, there's some truth in some of those ideas. It is not true that people have different levels of worth based on their position. That is wrong. But the idea that all authority can ultimately be traced back to God, that is not wrong. And that is an idea that we would be more biblical if we recovered that idea more fully in our own thinking. Nevertheless, this chart gives you a sense. You have the lords, the vassals, and then the knights and the peasants. these, with the king at the top of the pyramid, typically, in the feudal system, it was understood that those higher up would wield their authority and their influence to provide protection for those under them. So there was an understood relationship where those higher in rank in society would protect the ones lower in rank, but the ones lower in rank were responsible to provide for the lifestyle or the upkeep of those above them. So there was this exchange of provision for protection, of really respect and honor being given in payment for the help that was offered by the king or any person higher in social rank than the one giving the provisions or payments. Peasants lived dull lives. That's understood. Feudalism meant that the lord of the manor was responsible for protecting the people that lived on his land, and they served him. This is not the same as slavery, right? Serfdom was not the same as slavery. The king could not buy and sell serfs. The serfs, there was a sense really carried from biblical teaching. There was a sense of the dignity of the serfs on some level. They were not property, they were individuals. But nonetheless, they were often abused, they were often mistreated, and their lives were really, really quite terrible by modern standards, or by any standards. Most peasants were, as we've said, serfs. They would work 4 days a week to grow food for the lord of the manor, and they would have 2 days of the week to work on their own crops. Life for the serf was not much better than that of the slave, but as I said, they could not be sold by the lord of the manor. Another comment here about the social structure. Medieval social theory held that society was made up of 3 estates. So this is a bit different from the chart of the social structure that we talked about. This is that there were 3 different groupings of authority. The nobility, composed of a small hereditary aristocracy whose mission on earth was to rule over and defend the body politic. The church, whose duty was to look after the spiritual welfare of that body. And everyone else, the large mass of commoners who were supposed to do the work that provided for its physical needs. This structure is interesting and probably came about partly just out of necessity, because the church held a great amount of authority, and the teaching of the church viewed itself at the time as a physical kingdom. This stems from a misunderstanding of a lot of scripture. There was this sense that the church needed physical dominion on earth, and that dominion would ultimately culminate in the return of Christ. This set the church up as a physical power structure that rivaled the political power structures of the time. A careful study of this reality highlights the danger of heresy, the pain and suffering that can result from a misunderstanding of Scripture and a misunderstanding of what the Bible really teaches concerning the nature of the church. Had they understood more clearly what Christ meant when he talked about the keys of the kingdom, when he talked about his kingdom not being of this world, of the spiritual nature of the kingdom of God. If they had, for example, even read Augustine more carefully in his great work, magnum opus, the City of God, they would have understood much more deeply and would have avoided much of the tragedy of this time period. A little bit more about the social structure here. However, over time, into these estates were layered into a complex, interrelated, and unstable social strata, among which birth, wealth, profession, and personal ability all played a part in determining one's status in a world that was rapidly changing economically, politically, and socially. These changes would particularly come about because of the rise of a middle class. The middle class, which is a large and prosperous group of people that emerged particularly with the rise of trade. So an economic system allowed for people who were not wealthy, who did not have great possessions, to grow in their material wealth and their possessions, and this challenged the way things were. It was no longer simply a matter of how you were born. It became more and more a reality that you could grow, you could develop. Someone who was born poor could die wealthy, and that phenomena began to challenge the status quo of the three estates. Chaucer came on the scene with his writings as this reality became more and more evident. He was born into this urban middle class. Through his association with the court and his service to the king, he attained the rank of esquire, roughly equivalent to what would later be termed a gentleman. His career brought him into contact with the overlapping bourgeois and aristocratic social worlds, without being securely anchored in either. So if you read more about Chaucer's life, he traveled widely as a representative of the king. He did important work as an official in the king's court, even though he was not born into the aristocratic social strata. He operated in it. He lived in it. He was around people in it for most of his life. He also learned several languages. He traveled a lot. He was very much aware of the world around him, as well as being a careful, critical thinker who understood things about his time much more deeply than most people around him. Chaucer's childhood allowed him to be fluent in French and Italian. He was schooled in Latin and acquired the manners and skills required for service in the ruling class. Chaucer was a member of the court, and would have come in contact with royalty not just from England, but the royalty of many other European countries. Comment here about his language. Poetry would have been among the many diversions cultivated in Chaucer's youth. He was taught what we would call classically. He read the great works of literature of the past, particularly the works of the Western tradition. Those would have been what influenced him. He knew Homer. He knew Virgil. And the idea of a journey and stories on a journey would have been familiar to him a long time before he began writing his own epic that was based on stories told by travelers. The cultural significance of the Canterbury Tales, which is Chaucer's greatest work, really cannot be overstated, I don't think. This is one of the reasons why we continue to read it, even though I personally don't care much for many of the stories. The stories are, well, frankly, at times very pagan. They are off-color at times. The stories he tells, they contain crude and crass elements as the different characters attempt to insult each other in various ways. And that's just the way it is. But the stories are significant, and I want to talk a bit about their significance. So his decision to write the Canterbury Tales in Middle English instead of in French or Italian was at the time an innovative decision. English was considered vulgar. It was considered unimportant. And to choose to write a major literary work in the language of the people was a huge decision, but it was a decision that would become pivotal in changing the way people thought about their native language, which would lay some of the groundwork for the Renaissance later on, really hundreds of years later on. But this was a part of a changing mindset, and Chaucer certainly helped that change along with this decision. It is one of the most important reasons that the poem is still relevant today. It is really the first English poem, certainly the first major English poem. There were some English poems in Anglo-Saxon, but this is a phenomenal difference as a truly educated and incredible writer decides to write his major work in the language of the common people of England. Chaucer's purpose. Well, the audience of the Canterbury Tales was not intended to be members of the courts and the upper classes. That his poem, but instead he had a new audience in mind, a national one, that would understand the social framework of his pilgrims. So he's writing for the common people, not just for the aristocracy, and also not for the people of the educated elite. The characters of the poem will also be a lot of common people, and he will at times be making fun. He'll be poking fun at the people, the aristocratic level. The pilgrims that best reflect Chaucer's actual audience were those that had been called the new men, those who came from the emerging sector of society, who had literary skills and interests, and whose tales drew upon the new European literary cultures. It was from this new and quickly growing population of gentry, freemen, merchants, and people from the new middle classes, or the new middle class, that the Canterbury Tales were written for and written about. This is part of what makes this work stand out. It represents this idea of an emerging middle class. Here you have travelers going on a pilgrimage, and they are all telling stories. They are all, in a sense, representing different social classes, and yet there's a commonality. There's a common journey. There's a common interest, a common destination. There are common problems. There's a common humanity. And so, in a sense, this is a story about the leveling of human society. It is about removing the stratified view of society that had existed for so long up to this point. The Canterbury Tales tells the story of a group of pilgrims on their way to the Canterbury Cathedral, and it gives the readers a view of a cross-section, meaning representing many different characters or people or levels of middle-aged society. The use of a journey as a frame is one of the oldest narrative devices. So remember that what a frame narrative is. A frame narrative is a story that fits within another story. And so you see a frame with, for example, the Scarlet Letter, where the narrator finds this letter A and an actual written letter in a custom house. And it is that frame of finding that begins his own story. In a sense, a lot of what you read in the Odyssey is a frame story, because it is Odysseus on his way home when he comes to the Phaeacians in, I think it's chapter 4 of the Odyssey, is when he begins telling the backstory. And he goes through several chapters which are him describing to the king of the Phaeacians his past travels. And so you have a frame narrative inside the story of the Odyssey. A lot of books are written with certain frames around the stories, and so this story follows that same model. You have this frame of a group of travelers going to Canterbury, and on their way there, they are each going to tell stories. And the reason why they do this we'll come to in a second, but just giving you this overview that this is a frame narrative, and what a frame narrative is. Just so that we're clear on terminology, remember that a pilgrimage, by definition, is a journey, especially a long one, made to some sacred place as an act of religious devotion. Different religions place different importances on pilgrimage. Of course, Islam is probably the most famous for its pilgrimages, as a pilgrimage in Islam is required. It is mandated, or at least strongly encouraged, that if a Muslim is at all capable, they are required to visit the sacred sites in the Middle East of the Islamic faith. Christians have throughout history at different times also done pilgrimages. The problem is that these pilgrimages are ideas borrowed from other religions or from other religious beliefs. There is nothing in the Bible that warrants or commands these pilgrimages. The wealthy in medieval times would sometimes do pilgrimages to Jerusalem, to what was called the Holy Land, the land of Israel. And it was believed that through those pilgrimages they could become closer to God, they could merit God's favor. And that, of course, again, is a very tragic result of false teaching, because it would leave poor people at a distinct disadvantage, which is not what God has commanded. God makes it very clear that those who are spiritually impoverished are not at a disadvantage in coming to Christ. But this was not the teaching of some churches during the Middle Ages. Pilgrimages that were shorter were sometimes carried out by poorer people. So there would be holy sites that for different reasons were given importance. And you would have people who did not have the means to take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to go and see the Golgotha, or the temple site, or the tomb where Christ supposedly, the supposed tomb, Christ did rise, but exactly where he rose from is not a matter of absolute certainty. But these are the issues that this is the idea of the pilgrimage. It was very, very important in the Middle Ages, and our travelers in this story will be people who are going on a pilgrimage. Specifically, they are going to the Canterbury Cathedral. The cathedral at Canterbury is important for a number of reasons. Historically, it's an important site in England, religious site, because of the role that it played as Christianity came into England. It was very significant. It was a religious center historically. Pope Alexander, though, in the Middle Ages, canonized Thomas à Becket, who was in charge of the cathedral at Canterbury. He was the main officiating cleric there for a long time. But Thomas à Becket was murdered, and there's a shrine to him there. There still is, and there was then, a shrine to Thomas à Becket. Thomas à Becket was killed by the king because he resisted the king's desire to operate autonomously, separate from the church. When Becket was killed, the local people apparently managed to obtain pieces of cloth soaked in his blood, and the rumors were that these pieces of cloth healed people of miracles, and so this resulted in the canonization of Thomas à Becket. He was promoted by the Pope to sainthood, and so his tomb became a shrine and a center for pilgrimages for really many, many years, for hundreds of years. This church was particularly important in the religious life of the English people. It is a beautiful cathedral. You see here some images of the outside of it, an aerial view of it, the inside, just an astoundingly beautiful building. Another picture of the inside, a picture of the tomb of Thomas à Becket there in the church. Really, really phenomenal place. The Canterbury Tales begins with the travelers spending the night at an inn before setting out on their pilgrimage to Canterbury Cathedral. At the inn, at dinner, the inn's host, Harry Bailey, proposes that since the group of travelers will be traveling together for a long time, they should come up with a game to help pass the time. The host proposes that everyone be required to tell 4 stories, 2 on the way to Canterbury Cathedral and 2 on the way back. The host offers to travel with them, and he will judge the stories. And the winner of the stories will be bought. The other travelers will pay for a meal for the winner of the stories. So they will get a free dinner paid for by the other pilgrims when they return from Canterbury. And this journey, as you see on the map, really goes from London, from Southwark in London, through Greenwich to Canterbury near the coast. And this, of course, is the coast near to Europe. So you can see down here, it's right across the channel from Europe. The River Thames, they're running by England out into the channel, but the path they would have traveled is the dotted line there. Written in Middle English, this is not as hard to read as Beowulf was. You can see the comparison here, and the text that I'm having you read from will actually have these 2 side by side. But you can see at the top, each one of you should help make things. So each is written with 2 E's and a CH. Not that big a difference. You just have a second E instead of an A. And short is spelled with an E on the end. R has an E on the end. Way has an E on the end. And that's one of the main differences here, is you have a whole lot more E's in Middle English. But you can look at that some more later on if you want to. I just wanted to mention some of that. It is readable. Most people who can read modern English can read Middle English fairly easily, which makes it quite different from, say, the Anglo-Saxon that we saw with Beowulf. But this is still a lot harder than, say, the King James English of 1611. Again, the travelers, you have this group of travelers, particularly there's 29 of them, and they agree as they set out the next day, they're going to go along with Harry Bailey's idea, and they're going to tell these stories, 2 each on the way there and 2 each on the way back. So there's 29 travelers and Harry Bailey, which make up 30 travelers. This would result in a total of 120 stories. This would have been a massive book had it have been completed. But Chaucer only completed 22 of the stories. We have fragments of 2 others, and we have these stories in a number of different manuscripts. Most scholars feel that what is called the Ellesmere manuscript is the most authoritative and reliable version of the story. And that manuscript is beautifully written with a lot of decorations on the text, as in the example picture shown there. But just to remember that we don't have all the stories. We have a very limited number of what would have been 120 stories in a collection. Chaucer himself is in the poem, and on the pilgrimage to the cathedral, and we know this because there is an I in the text. He refers to himself in the first person. This narrator figure allows Chaucer to interject himself into the story or the opinions without really claiming that they're his own. So the I in the story is Chaucer in a sense, but it's a caricature of Chaucer. we don't really know if that person is meant to reflect the thoughts and ideas of Chaucer, but it gives him the opportunity to at least hint at those if he chooses to. And this character that Chaucer puts into the story, this narrator, first-person narrator, is a source of a lot of the satire and irony in the poem. You will find that this story contains immense amounts of irony. For example, the knight has rusted armor. The knight is a man's man. I mean, he is a man of great nobility. He's able to fight great wars for Christianity. But as we read the story, it becomes obvious that he has lost the war at home. He's lost the most important aspect of his life, in that his own son is not following in his ways of honor and dignity and in some ways of masculinity. He has not, in a sense, helped his son convert to Christianity. His son is clearly embracing a lifestyle that is very different from that of his father. And so while this knight has rode off in the great wars of Christianity, his home has crumbled. This is an insightful comment in and of itself on society of the time, and shows Chaucer's forward thinking and really deeply religious thinking in a way. But at the same time, it's meant as a satire. It's meant to be ironic. You'll see that in many, many ways. One of the noble ladies who is praised for her nobility, Chaucer slips in the comment that every time she drinks from a cup, there's a pool of grease left behind on the top of the drink. And so in that way, he's mocking the upper class, who pretend so often to be cleaner and better than everyone else, but they leave their messes behind for other people to deal with. And that's why, in effect, they are clean, because other people are doing their dirty work for them. This is the kind of satire and humor that you'll find layered throughout this book, everywhere you turn. The pilgrims' facial features, the clothes they wear, the foods they like to eat, the things they say, the work they do, are all clues not only of their social rank, but to their moral and spiritual condition. And through the accumulation of detail, speak to the condition of the late medieval society, of which collectively they are representative. And so again, you've just got this group of people who, through all of their idiosyncrasies, through all of their oddities, they represent this society as a whole. The church, particularly in this case, we are talking about the Roman Catholic Church of the medieval time period. It, with all of its good and bad. So there was both in many ways, and in large servings. It was the most important social institution of the medieval times, and it touched the life of every citizen. There were various jobs in the clergy, several of which are dealt with in the Canterbury Tales, and will be introduced later on to the different religious functions of, for example, the pardoner, the monk, the reeve. They each have different religious roles, different offices, different functions that they fulfill, with different levels of integrity, as we'll see. Cathedralism. So this is a an odd term, but I just wanted to cover this briefly with this quotation here. There's a tendency to think about the Middle Ages as a single culture, epitomized by the great Gothic cathedrals, in which architecture, art, music, and liturgy seem to join in magnificent expressions of unified faith. Such a view overlooks the diversity of medieval cultures and the social, political, religious, economic, and technological changes that took place over this vastly long period of time. So that's an insightful quotation from a work that I have in the list of works at the end of this. You can read that whole essay, and it'll be quite helpful, I think, in many ways. But what this is highlighting is just the complexity of medieval culture. We tend to flatten it. We tend to view it in one way. Some classical scholars will describe it focusing on the great cathedrals, on the liturgy, on the beauty, on the magnificent expressions of unified faith. Other works like Monty Python and the Holy Grail will flatten it, focusing on the negative aspects, and will just look at the ignorance and the superstition and the dirt and the plagues and all that was bad. And that too is not a fair representation of the Middle Ages. What this work does for us is remind us of the great complexity of the human experience in the Middle Ages.